For years, the tunnel had been treated as empty, a dead end nobody bothered mapping past the first 50 feet. Then a scanning team finally pushed further, and what came back on their screen made two of them shut the equipment down without finishing the scan. If your own team stopped mid-scan and wouldn't explain why, would you push them to finish it or trust their instinct to stop? And for everyone watching tonight, where in the world are you tuning in from? Stay with this one, because it doesn't end the way most stories like it usually do. This is a legend, told the way stories like this always are. Passed between people who worked near the site, retold by people who only heard fragments of it secondhand, shifting slightly every time it changes hands, but always circling back to the same handful of details that never quite soften, no matter how many times the story gets repeated. It is not a claim about any real company, any real production, or any real named individual. It's a fictional account built around a familiar kind of setup, a forgotten tunnel, a scanning crew, and a discovery nobody involved has ever fully explained. According to the story, the tunnel had sat mostly ignored for decades before anyone took a serious interest in it. It had originally been dug for a purpose nobody could fully reconstruct by the time this story picks up. Some combination of utility access and old mining activity. According to the fragments of municipal record that still existed, though even those records were incomplete enough that no one could say with certainty which purpose came first or when the tunnel had actually been abandoned. What everyone did agree on was that it had been treated, for as long as anyone could remember, as a dead end. 50 feet in, the passage narrowed, the ceiling dropped, and generations of casual visitors had simply assumed that was the end of it. Nobody had ever bothered to check further because nobody had any particular reason to. That assumption held for years, right up until a scanning team was brought in as part of a broader survey effort covering several old, forgotten structures across the region. Their equipment was more advanced than anything that had ever been used to examine this tunnel before. Ground-penetrating radar, paired with acoustic mapping technology capable of detecting voids and passages well beyond what a flashlight and a narrowing ceiling could reveal to the naked eye. The tunnel was included in their survey almost as an afterthought, one of several minor sites on a long list, expected to confirm exactly what everyone already assumed. 50 feet of passage, then solid rock, nothing more. The scan told a different story almost immediately. Rather than confirming a dead end at the expected 50-foot mark, the acoustic data indicated the passage continued considerably further than anyone had assumed, curving away from the section that had always been visible and extending into a section of the structure nobody had ever documented. The scanning team's initial reaction, according to the story, was excitement rather than concern. An unexpectedly extended passage is exactly the kind of discovery a survey team hopes for, the sort of finding that justifies the tedious work of scanning dozens of unremarkable sites in the hope that one of them turns out to be more significant than expected. That excitement didn't last long. As the team extended their scan further into the newly discovered section, the data began producing readings that didn't fit cleanly into any of the categories their equipment was designed to identify. Acoustic mapping works by interpreting how sound waves reflect off different surfaces and materials, building a picture of a space's shape and dimensions based on those reflections. Solid rock produces one kind of signature. Open air produces another. Water, loose debris, structural voids. Each has its own recognizable pattern that a trained team knows how to read. What the team found deeper in the tunnel didn't match any of those familiar patterns cleanly. According to the story, the reading suggested something with mass, something occupying space in a way that wasn't consistent with either solid rock or empty passage, positioned roughly midway along the newly discovered extension. The team's first assumption was equipment malfunction, the same reasonable assumption any team would reach first when their instruments start producing results that don't match any established category. They recalibrated, ran the scan again, and got a strikingly similar result the second time. Whatever was down there, it was consistent enough across repeated scans that a simple equipment glitch became harder and harder to accept as the explanation. It was at this point, according to the legend, that the team decided to supplement their acoustic data with a live camera feed, lowering a small, remotely operated unit down into the newly discovered section to get a direct visual on whatever the scans had been detecting. This was meant to be a straightforward confirmation step, the kind of thing survey teams do constantly to double-check ambiguous instrument readings against actual visual evidence. Nobody expected it to be anything other than routine. The footage from that camera is the part of this legend that gets told most inconsistently, and that inconsistency is, in its own way, one of the most unsettling details in the entire story. Ask different people who claim to have seen it or heard detailed secondhand accounts of it, and you'll get noticeably different descriptions. Some versions describe a shape pressed against the tunnel wall, something that briefly seemed to shift position as the camera's light passed over it before the operators pulled the unit back. Other versions focus less on any specific visual detail and more on the reaction of the two team members who were controlling the camera feed directly. An account describes them shutting the equipment down abruptly well before the scan was scheduled to finish, and refusing for several minutes afterward to explain to the rest of the crew exactly what they'd seen. Have you ever seen something secondhand that changed depending on who was telling you about it, where the core of the story stayed the same, but every detail around the edges seemed to shift with each new person you asked? And what actually matters more to you when you're trying to piece together a story like this one? The footage itself, or how consistently or inconsistently people react to it? Because the inconsistency here isn't accidental. According to those who've spent time trying to track down every version of this legend, it's part of what makes the story feel less like a fabricated tale passed down for entertainment, and more like an authentic account distorted by the ordinary human unreliability of memory and secondhand retelling. A story invented from scratch tends to stay consistent because whoever created it controls every detail. A story built from fragmented, independently retold accounts of something that actually happened tends to fray at the edges exactly the way this one has, with the core details: the tunnel, the unexpected extension, the ambiguous scan, the abrupt equipment shutdown, remaining stable across every version, while the smaller visual specifics shift depending on who's doing the remembering. What happened immediately after the camera was pulled back is one of the few points where most versions of the legend actually agree. The two team members who'd been operating the equipment reportedly needed several minutes before they were willing to discuss what's this scene with the rest of the crew. And when they finally did, their account was notably restrained rather than dramatic. They didn't describe anything overtly terrifying. They described something they couldn't identify, something whose presence in that space didn't match any explanation readily available to them. And a shared, immediate instinct that continuing to push the camera further into that section of tunnel that night wasn't something either of them wanted to be responsible for doing. The rest of the crew, according to the story, didn't push back on that instinct. Whatever had shown up on the camera feed, combined with the acoustic readings that had already flagged something unusual before the camera was even deployed, was enough to convince the entire team that finishing the scan could wait until they'd had time to properly review what they already had. They packed up for the night, left the tunnel's newly discovered section undisturbed, and reconvened the following morning to go over the footage and data as a group in daylight with considerably more people present than the two who'd been directly monitoring the equipment the night before. That daylight review, according to the legend, didn't resolve much. The acoustic data still showed the same unexplained mass occupying roughly the same position it had the night before. The footage, reviewed carefully by the full team this time, was described afterward as genuinely ambiguous. Clear enough to confirm that something was there, blurry and poorly lit enough that nobody could confidently say what it actually was. Several crew members reportedly wanted to send the camera back down immediately to get better footage under improved lighting conditions. Others were considerably more hesitant, citing the same instinct that had led the two original operators to shut things down the night before. The disagreement, according to the story, never fully resolved on its own terms. What ended up happening instead was a decision made further up the chain, outside the immediate crew's control, to pause the survey of that particular tunnel indefinitely while the broader project moved forward with other sites on their list. No formal explanation was given for the pause beyond general language about prioritizing other locations first. The tunnel simply stopped being part of the active survey. Its newly discovered extension left exactly as undocumented as it had been before the scan that found it. The whole matter shelved rather than resolved. It's worth pausing here to weigh the different ways a story like this could actually make sense, the same way any legend built around an unverified, unconfirmed event deserves genuine scrutiny rather than simple, uncritical acceptance at face value. There's the technical explanation, which has to be considered first, regardless of how unsettling the footage sounds secondhand. Acoustic mapping equipment, particularly in confined, echo-heavy underground spaces, can produce ambiguous or misleading readings under a range of ordinary conditions. Unusual rock formations that scatter sound waves in atypical patterns. Pockets of standing water that reflect signals differently than the surrounding stone, or subtle equipment drift that produces a false impression of mass where none actually exists. A camera operating under poor lighting conditions in an unfamiliar confined space is also prone to producing genuinely ambiguous footage that two tired, on-edge crew members might reasonably interpret as more alarming than a calmer, more controlled review would ultimately support. There's the wildlife explanation, one that doesn't require anything beyond an animal already occupying a section of tunnel that had simply never been explored by anyone before this survey. Underground environments regularly house creatures that avoid light and human contact entirely, and the sudden appearance of a scanning device and camera light in a space that had likely been undisturbed for decades could easily produce exactly the kind of ambiguous, briefly shifting shape described in some versions of the footage, without requiring anything beyond an ordinary animal reacting defensively to an unfamiliar intrusion into what had functionally become its own undisturbed territory. And then there's the explanation this legend keeps circling back to, the one that never fully lets go, no matter how many mundane possibilities get offered first. That whatever the team detected that night wasn't a known animal reacting to disturbance, and wasn't simply an artifact of poor lighting or ambiguous acoustic data either, but something that had occupied that space for far longer than anyone realized, undisturbed specifically because the tunnel's assumed dead end had kept it that way for years. That's the version of the story that tends to stick with people longest, not necessarily because it's the most probable explanation, but because it's the only one that fully accounts for both pieces of evidence together. The consistent acoustic signature and the footage two experienced crew members found unsettling enough to abandon the scan entirely, rather than requiring two separate coincidences to explain each piece independently. None of these explanations are confirmed, and the legend, true to its nature, refuses to settle on one. That refusal is exactly why the story has continued circulating among people connected to the survey project, or people who heard about it from someone who was long after the crew that documented it originally moved on to other sites. There's a detail worth including here that rarely survives the shorter, more compressed retellings of this story, but tends to stick with people once they hear it in full. According to a few versions of the legend, one member of the original two-person camera team eventually left survey work altogether within the following year, a career change several former co-workers reportedly found surprising given how long that person had worked in the field without any prior indication of wanting to leave it. Whether that decision had anything to do with what happened in the tunnel or was simply an unrelated life change that coincidentally followed close behind it is something the legend has never resolved, and the person in question has, by every account, never publicly discussed the reason either way. That's a strange kind of ending for a story built around a moment of genuine documented ambiguity. Most legends like this eventually build toward either confirmation or debunking, some kind of resolution that finally settles the question one way or the other, closing the door on further speculation. This one never quite gets there, and at this point, it likely never will. It ends instead with a pause survey, a night of footage that has never been fully reviewed or released beyond the crew who originally saw it, and a decision made quietly, without much explanation, to simply stop looking any further. So here's where we leave it, the same way this story has always been left with everyone who's heard it before. If your own scanning equipment picked up something with mass, something occupying a space nothing should have been occupying, would you send the camera back down to get a clearer look? Or would the same instinct that made two experienced crew members shut everything down mid-scan be reason enough to leave that tunnel exactly as unexplored and exactly as unexplained as it's remained ever since?